Under the floor of a Tuscan chapel sits a sword embedded in solid rock, and X-rays confirm the iron is genuinely 800 years old. In the imperial treasury in Vienna rests a coronation blade containing trace elements that point to a single mountain in the Alps. In a museum in Burgos, a sword once dismissed as folklore turns out to be forged from steel that medieval Europe was not supposed to be able to make. These are not props. These are not legends. They are real blades, in real cases, in real museums, and every one of them carries a metallurgical signature that the textbooks of medieval Europe cannot fully account for. Today, 6 swords that should not exist for their era. Each one has been weighed, dated, scanned, and analyzed. Not one of them fits comfortably into the standard story of how medieval Europe forged its iron, and the textbooks, in most cases, were written before the measurements were taken. The first one is the strangest of them all because there are around 170 of them, and almost no one has heard the name. We start in Northern Europe in the 9th century. Picture the smoke of a Frankish forge somewhere along the Rhine, the orange glow of charcoal under hand-pumped bellows, a smith leaning over a billet of iron. By the standards of the era, this is high technology. By the standards of what was about to come out of that forge, it is barely a beginning. Around 170 blades survive, bearing a single inscription welded into the steel itself, Ulfberht. They were buried in graves from Ireland to the Volga, dropped in rivers, lost in bogs, recovered by archaeologists across 2 centuries. When materials scientist Dr. Alan Williams of the Wallace Collection in London examined a genuine Ulfberht under the microscope, the result was not just unusual. It was, by 9th century standards, impossible. The carbon content reached close to 1%, true crucible steel with almost no slag. To produce that steel, you needed a furnace capable of around 1600 degrees Celsius, sustained for hours. European forges were not supposed to reach that temperature consistently for another 8 centuries. The raw material itself appears to have come from the Indian subcontinent, Wootz steel, traded along the Volga route through the Islamic world into Frankish hands. Here is the part that lands hardest. The brand was so prized that medieval forgers tried to fake it. Counterfeit Ulfberhts exist with the inscription misspelled, the steel ordinary bloomery iron, the warrior who bought one almost certainly unaware that he was carrying a knockoff. A medieval consumer market for high-end steel with brand piracy in the 9th century. Nothing in our picture of that century is supposed to be ready for that. And the trade route that brought the raw material, Volga, Caspian, Persia, India, is documented in the archaeology, but absent from the standard textbook account of where Frankish iron came from. From a forge along the Rhine, we move to a glass case in the Louvre, where a sword that has been continuously rebuilt for over 1,000 years still serves as the coronation blade of the kings of France. Joyeuse, the sword of Charlemagne. Or, more honestly, the sword that has been called Charlemagne's sword for so long that the name has fused to the object. It rests today in the Department of Decorative Arts of the Louvre, and from the coronation of Philip Augustus in 1180 to the coronation of Charles X in 1825, it was placed into the hand of every French king at the moment they became king. The legend says the pommel contains a fragment of the lance of Longinus. The legend says the blade changed color 30 times a day. The reality, when modern conservators took the sword apart, is almost stranger than the legend. Joyeuse is not a single sword. It is a composite, assembled across centuries. The pommel dates to roughly the 10th or 11th century. The crossguard is 12th century work. The grip was replaced in the 13th. The scabbard was redone in the 19th. Each French king, in effect, inherited a sword that had already been rebuilt by his predecessors. But the analysis revealed something the textbooks were not ready for. Components within the blade itself have been dated as early as the 9th century, overlapping, just barely, with Charlemagne's actual lifetime. Whether the original 9th century blade was his, no one can prove. What we can say is that a piece of iron from his century is still inside the object that crowns kings. 800 years of monarchy, holding on to a fragment of metal forged when Aachen was still a capital. This artifact has been on display since the 19th century. Its standard caption has not been updated to reflect every measurement modern conservators have taken. If you find that ordinary documentaries tell this kind of story too flatly. The blade is from the 9th century, the hilt from the 13th, end of label. Subscribe. This channel goes where the textbooks stop. Now, to Castile, where a sword once dismissed as a fairy tale turned out to be forged from impossible steel. The Tizona of El Cid. Burgos, Spain. For decades, historians treated the sword in the Museum of Burgos the way you treat a fairy tale prop. Pleasant, pious, almost certainly not what it claimed to be. The legend said it had belonged to Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the 11th century Castilian warlord remembered as El Cid Campeador. The label said maybe. The scholarship, for most of the 20th century, said almost certainly not. Then, in 1999, the metallurgist Alonso Victor de Sea conducted a detailed analysis of the blade. Carbon content, microstructure, slag distribution, forge welding pattern. The results were not ambiguous. The steel was consistent with 11th century Moorish forging techniques, specifically associated with Cordoba. The structure was crucible steel adjacent, closer to what was being produced in the Islamic world than to anything coming out of Christian European forges of the same era. The hilt was 16th century work, added later. The blade was real and old, and made by a tradition the textbooks of Castilian history tend to mention only in footnotes. Notice what the metallurgy is quietly telling us. 11th century Iberian steel, made under Islamic technical influence, was good enough that a Castilian warlord who fought on both sides of the Christian-Muslim frontier wanted that steel in his hand. Not the steel of his own kingdom, the steel of his enemies, and sometimes his employers. The Tizona is a small piece of evidence for a transfer of metallurgical knowledge across the Pyrenees that mainstream histories often understate. The textbook explanation calls it a relic of doubtful authenticity. The microscope calls it a Cordoban masterpiece. Quick aside before we move on, drop your country in the comments. I am genuinely curious how far this story has traveled. Now, across the channel, to a sword whose tip was deliberately broken at the forge 800 years ago to embody an idea. The crown jewels of England include a sword you have probably never heard of, even though it has been used in the coronation of every English monarch in living memory. It is called Curtana, the Sword of Mercy. The current blade is believed to incorporate elements from the 13th century, which already makes it the oldest item in continuous ceremonial use in the British monarchy. But the strange thing about Curtana is not its age, it is its tip. The tip is broken, square-cut, blunt, deliberately so. Tradition links the sword to Tristan, to Ogier the Dane, to Edward the Confessor, names that wander between history and romance. The legend says the tip was broken in single combat when an angel intervened to prevent a killing blow. The reality, examined by the royal armories, is that the blunting appears intentional. A medieval sword forged or modified to be incapable of killing. Think about what that requires. A culture that, in the 13th century, decided to manufacture a piece of state regalia that was a sword in every visual respect, and not a sword in the only respect that mattered to a medieval warrior, the doctrine of royal mercy, made physical. There is no other surviving European sword from the period that was deliberately produced to be ceremonially incomplete in this way. And the question of whether the tip was broken at the forge or cut later, on purpose, has never been fully resolved. Of the cases we have walked through so far, has any one of them changed your picture of the medieval mind? Hold that thought. The next case is going to test it harder. Vienna, the imperial treasury. In a hall surrounded by the regalia of the Holy Roman Empire, orbs, crowns, scepters, reliquaries, there is a sword named for a 3rd century Roman legionary saint, used to coronate emperors 1,000 years after his death, the Sword of Saint Maurice. The version housed in Vienna is the more historically significant of the two surviving claimants to that name. Its core blade has been dated to the 12th century. The grip and the gilded ornamentation were added during the coronation of Otto IV in 1198, when the sword was placed in his hand at the moment he became Holy Roman Emperor. Every emperor after Otto, for centuries, took up the same blade. Here is where the metallurgy gets specific. Trace element analysis of the iron points to a particular ore source in the Eastern Alps, meaning the smith who forged it was working from a local, identifiable supply, not generic medieval iron stock. The forge welding technique used to bind the core of the blade to its edges is unusually sophisticated for a late 12th century Central European workshop. The marks on the steel are consistent with a high-status Germanic forge operating at a level the standard accounts of 12th century European metallurgy do not generally credit. A blade named for a Roman saint, forged by a German smith in the Alps, used to crown Holy Roman emperors for hundreds of years. 1,000 years of European history compressed into a single weapon. And the seventh, well, technically the sixth, and the one most archaeologists wish would go away. Stay with me. It is also the one with the cleanest evidence. Tuscany, a small round chapel on a hilltop near Siena called the Rotonda di Montesiepi. Embedded in a block of stone in the floor of that chapel, with about 30 centimeters of blade still buried in the rock, sits a sword. The legend says it was driven into the stone in the year 1180 by a young Tuscan knight named Galgano Guidotti, who had renounced violence and pushed his sword into the rock as a cross to pray before. He died the following year, was canonized in 1185, and the chapel was built around the sword. For 8 centuries, almost no one took the story seriously. The whole thing was assumed to be a medieval echo of the Arthurian legend, a local imitation, a pious fraud, a relic for pilgrims. Then in the early 2000s, Professor Luigi Garlascelli, a chemist at the University of Pavia, conducted a sustained investigation, radiocarbon dating on organic material adhering to the blade, metallurgical analysis on the exposed iron. The results were consistent with a 12th century origin. The sword is real. The date is real. The iron is genuinely from the era of Galgano Guidotti. Then ground-penetrating radar was run on the stone beneath the sword. The radar showed a cavity underneath, a chamber, possibly a burial chamber, directly below the embedded blade. Whatever is in that cavity has not been excavated. The chapel authorities have not granted permission. We are, in 2026, in the position of knowing that a real 12th century sword is real, that it really is embedded in real rock, that there is something hollow underneath it, and that no one has looked. The textbook explanation is that the stone was carved out around an existing sword and then sealed. The radar signature does not entirely cooperate with that reading. The legend, after 800 years, has stopped being entirely a legend and started being a measurement problem. 6 swords, 6 museums, 6 small fractures in our assumptions about what medieval Europe could make, what it could trade, what it could preserve, and what it could believe. The Ulfberht steel came from India. The Tizona came from a Cordoban forge whose technical lineage Christian Europe was not supposed to share. The Saint Maurice came from a specific mountain in the eastern Alps. Joyeuse is a sword that has been continuously rebuilt around an ancient core for over 1,000 years. Katana is a deliberate idea, sharpened into iron and then unsharpened on purpose. And the Montesiepi sword is a piece of 12th century iron sitting in a Tuscan rock above an unexcavated chamber. What unites them is not lost knowledge. It is the way medieval Europe quietly received, transmitted, and preserved metallurgical and ceremonial knowledge that the standard textbook chapters tend to flatten or skip. Trade routes our maps barely show. Forge techniques crossing religious frontiers, our histories prefer to keep clean. Symbolic gestures, a broken tip, a sealed chapel, that we still cannot fully decode. The artifacts are real. The methods in most cases are gone. The textbooks in most cases were written before the measurements were taken.